Marzluff is a wildlife biologist at the University of Washington. He has spent a career researching bird behavior and biodiversity and bird relationships with humans and human landscapes. We are really grateful that John has offered to spend his time with us tonight, speaking about a few things near and dear, I think, to our hearts in Yakima Valley, farms and meadowlarks. So please take it away, John.
Thanks, Cy and Matt. Hopefully my barking dogs aren't too loud back there. But it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight and to tell you a little bit about what I learned visiting a variety of farms, none in your valley, but some very close, and how they are coexisting with a variety of wildlife, but of course, as Cy said, birds in particular. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, this is the topic of a recent book I did. It is not an area of extreme research interest of mine. I'm interested in how we share our land with wildlife in general, and farming is such an important part of that land use that I felt compelled to take a look. I have a daughter who's a farmer, and my wife's family was and continues to farm land in Nebraska. So you'll hear a bit about that. So a bit of a personal reason for me, but more importantly, the personal tie to this bird, the western meadowlark. This is a species I know you are familiar with out in Yakima in the sage country. Fantastic singer, wonderful song that they have, bright yellow breasts when they turn and face you. So it's a bird to me that brings back a lot of memories from my childhood in Kansas, where this bird and the eastern meadowlark were both very common. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. Although they are still found throughout their range, their numbers have declined quite a lot. So, for example, the eastern meadowlark has declined by 71% since they were counted on standard breeding bird survey counts in the late 60s. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but chief among them, of course, are the conversion of grasslands into farmland. And so that's what motivated me to try to understand a little bit more about not only how this conversion occurs, why it occurs, but how it might be done in a way that is better suited to hold things like meadowlarks. We first just take a look at the issue. The conversion of grassland is especially prominent throughout the Midwest and Western US. Maybe more even shrublands out here in the West have been converted. But the turquoise color you see on this slide through Kansas and Nebraska, Oklahoma, the Midwestern US, is all grassland at one point that has been converted to farmland now. And the places that haven't been converted either were too wet and forested extensively, or too dry to support much agriculture without the expense of watering. So this conversion basically has reduced, not only in the US, but worldwide, the amount of grasslands by over half. And that's been devastating for birds that rely upon grassland habitats and that have not been able to adapt to the more forested and broken habitats that characterize our farmlands. This conversion is continuing today. The amount of acreage that's lost in just a few years can be staggering. For example, one stat I have here from 2009 to 2015, 13% of the grass that remained in the US was lost. So let's take a look at some of these, what this looks like perhaps from a meadowlark's perspective. And it doesn't look good. I mean, here's a corn field in Nebraska just before harvest. It is dark. It is densely foliaged. It is noisy. If you go in there and try to count birds, which I did, it's not easy because of the rustling of leaves. There aren't really any weed seeds to eat. There are very few insects for a young bird to eat because of herbicides and pesticides that have been sprayed on this field. So it's quite productive in terms of corn, but very unproductive in terms of bird life. And that trend is reflected in overall loss of grassland birds. Here's just an example. I suspect some of you have participated on breeding bird surveys, but these are routes across the US and Canada and Mexico that basically stop every half mile, and an observer gets out and listens and looks for birds and counts them. And I just plot here the abundance of game birds, things like pheasants and quail, grassland birds, things like the meadowlark or various sparrows, and birds of prey through the years that the breeding bird surveys have been done on one route here throughout Nebraska. And basically, what you see is a dramatic decline, a loss of grassland birds and game birds, and an increase in birds of prey. This increase in birds of prey, the reason I plotted it was because the farmers I talked with in Nebraska indicated to me the reason we don't have pheasants and quail like we used to is because of all the hawks, that they're eating them. And that may be true to a very limited extent. There is an increase in birds of prey, but the increase here are not the birds that are out there in the grassland. These are the birds that are birds of prey like red-tailed hawks, great horned owls that are in the shelter belts that remain in these areas. So instead of birds of prey being the culprit really for the loss of these grassland birds, I would point you to this picture. And this is the picture from the inside of a combine as we're getting the last row of soybeans off of this field. There is not much habitat here, even when it's fully vegetated for birds, and especially after it's been harvested like this. There may be some wasted seed on the ground, but I tell you, these new combines are efficient. They don't miss much, and they get it at exactly the right time moisture-wise. It's really quite phenomenal, the technological abilities to harvest, but it doesn't leave much on the ground for birds to utilize. I'll come back to the technological advances because they are important in allowing us basically to feed an increasingly affluent and growing human population on the least amount of land possible. But if we just think about habitat here, it's not a very good place to be a meadowlark. So if we look at those acres planted in soybean and corn, again, in Nebraska in this case, they've increased through time. Not a huge amount, but they have increased. And more importantly, there's been a great increase in the amount of land that's sprayed with herbicides. So this is mainly Roundup being sprayed on modified plants that are able to tolerate the herbicide and not suffer from that, but enable the herbicide to kill the weeds that would be growing along with them. And as I indicated, looking at that field of corn, not having weed seeds there basically reduces not only some of the seeds that birds might use during the winter, but the insects that would be on those weeds for parent birds to feed to their young. I just plot the drought index here just to indicate that it's not going uniformly down or up to that it might influence the climate effects here might influence birds. It's not that. It's the amount of corn and the intensive use of corn and soybean, especially with herbicides. So that probably doesn't come as much a surprise to any of us who have tried to go birding in various places. But I thought it would be instructive not only to look at places like Nebraska. To me, that's a bit of a baseline. I mean, this is an area of the US that produces an awful lot of agricultural product, but to look at some other places as well. So as I go through these next sets of slides, you'll see this little map up here that will take us to various places from Costa Rica to Montana to Washington, looking at some of these farms. And my strategy was basically to go camp in these places, do some birding, talk with farmers, try to understand what they were doing, and to see for myself what the effects of their actions on the land were. So here's a nice soybean field. It was actually a pretty busy place. There were tree frogs there. There were owls in the few remaining copses of trees, but there wasn't much in terms of bird life that should have been there, the grassland birds. I did not see meadowlarks in this particular case. When I ran one of the breeding bird survey routes there, I saw 4 meadowlarks, 2 western and 2 eastern. So part of the reason for this conversion of land is the subsidies that are provided to farmers to grow corn and soybean. And this just shows our U.S. corn corn use. And this corn isn't grown for us to eat. About 5% or less of corn that's grown in the U.S., the red here, is basically for human consumption or for seed use. The great majority of it, the blue area here, is used for feeding cattle on feedlots in the Midwest. And an increasingly large amount through recent years is for production of biofuels. And these are incentivized programs, both for cattle feed and especially for fuel use now, that incentivize the planting of acres in corn so that the farmer can get a guaranteed price back for his effort. And so, for example, there are also programs that reward and incentivize farmers to put some of their habitat into lower use, maybe put it into production for wildlife, maybe to plant native pollinator species of plants that pollinators need. And I just, talked to farmers about that in the Midwest and asked them, where do you decide, when do you decide to do the conservation reserve versus planting corn? And the answer is pretty simple. A farmer in Nebraska in 2017, when I talked to them, would get $138 an acre for putting his land into the conservation reserve program. Again, planting it with species that pollinators use or ground covers that birds might use, or just fallowing it. In contrast, an acre of soybeans would net that farmer gross the farmer $665, and an acre of corn, $840 at that time. So incredibly poorly subsidized conservation use of land is driving farmers to not conserve land, not to do things for biodiversity on their land, but instead to do things where they will make the most money from their land. And they're business people, they have to do this. But our government could subsidize conservation programs more and get more farmers to basically conserve bits of their land as well. So the next place I went was Montana. And in Montana, I was interested in looking at wheat fields. Wheat's one of the most water intensive plants that we grow. You are very familiar with this up on the Columbia Plateau, where we have lots of wheat fields. We're using Columbia River water to irrigate those, and our yields are very high in Washington. In Montana, in places like where I went by Three Forks, they don't do a lot of irrigation because the water table is really, really low. So they would have to drill, as one farmer told me, miles to be able to get enough water to irrigate their crops. So instead, they basically, out of necessity, fallow their land 1 year out of every 3. And in this way, they let the land rest and collect moisture from snowfall, from rainfall, and regenerate the moisture profile in the soil so they can then farm it for 2 years in a row. And they let it rest again. And this is what it looks like when it's resting. And that habitat has got some structure from the wheat stubble, but it also has grain left in it. It's got weeds that are growing in it, and it allows space for animals to come in winter, especially there. One of the species that breeds in this area, this sort of habitat, is the horned lark. And this is not a species that is particularly at risk over most parts of its range. The streaked horned lark here in Western Washington is an endangered species, but I grew up with this version of the horned lark, and this was a bird you would find in very degraded, very arid lands. They, in fact, love the lands that are left fallow in this wheat area and breed there and do quite well. And this is a species that has declined and doesn't respond so well to the conservation reserve set-asides that I mentioned earlier, because those are typically getting land to be quite lush with either plants that pollinators can use or or others that will hold the soil better. This guy likes open areas, and by fallowing, just not producing anything on the land for a year, provides habitat for this species and also lots of other migrants. So Cy mentioned that I've done work on crows and ravens and continue to do work on ravens in the Yellowstone area. And as I was visiting that farm in Three Forks, Montana, where the wheat's grown, I noticed a lot of ravens. And this is an interesting farm because they not only grow wheat, but they have a bakery, they have a mill, and they produce flour and bread products. And those that they have left over, they compost back on the land, and that attracts gulls and ravens to come and forage there. Well, we've been tagging ravens in Yellowstone, and I was surprised to see that one of our birds had traveled over to this area. So I'll just show you a few slides. Here's some of our birds in the park. These dots that you see here are the points of one of our young birds. Here we tagged it way down here in Yellowstone. It was a bird, a 1-year-old female. She traveled up through the crazy mountains over to the area that I mentioned, crossing the Continental Divide back and forth a few times. If we zoom in on that, you can see that a density of her points exist right in this wheat country, some of which is fallow in this particular image. And if we take a closer look, you can see the fallowed land that's brown here. And this is where these birds are spending a lot of the winter. They are foraging there on composted bread products, and they are traveling. In this case, this bird traveled 100 or 150 miles to get to that spot. She has now, that was 3 years ago when we tagged her. This past summer, she has obtained a breeding territory there and has stayed and is breeding right there by this farm. So from Montana, we're going to take a little trip south to the wine country of California. And I was really interested to see what farmers are doing here because I'd read about it, and I have colleagues who work on owls there. And this is a barn owl box that you see here by the Tres Sabores vineyard. And many of the vintners in California and some in Washington are putting out barn owl boxes to attract this species so that it'll do some pest control for them. So for example, my friend Matt Johnson, who's a professor at Humboldt State University, is holding one of the barn owls here from one of the boxes that we were getting ready to ban. And they've estimated from telemetry and from camera observations in those boxes that a pair of breeding owls can consume about 1,000 gophers and rats from the vineyard each year. And so that's quite a benefit to the vintners, so that they don't have to go out and trap these animals or use any pesticides to try to get rid of them. Much greener way for them to be able to reduce the problems of having not only their vines chewed, but also the soil disturbed and holes created that are difficult for their machinery to get around. So it's a real win-win situation for the wineries and the owls, and the people that come and visit the wineries to be able to learn about the owls, to see them, and to be able to enjoy a glass of wine as they're doing it. Quite a deal. Nearby there are lots of rice farms in the Central Valley of California. And instead of burning their fields every autumn as they used to do, which created a problem with air quality, especially for those asthmatics and others in the area that were having trouble with the smoky air, they've started flooding their fields to allow the rice to degrade, much as they would with burning, but in this case degrade by being flooded and rotting and recycling those nutrients back into the soil for the next year's crop. But as those fields are flooded, they are incredibly attractive habitats for waterfowl, like these avocets and ibis that come in and spend the winter foraging within these for insects and utilizing them extensively. So another kind of win-win, easier situation for farmers in this case to flood rather than burn. They still get the same nutrient recharge to their lands, and they provide wildlife habitat during the time of year when they're not producing rice on that farm. So back in Washington, the west side of the Cascades, I've been doing some research at the Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center. This is a small farm setting that basically employs organic methods to produce a variety of vegetables and also to practice restoration of the riverine habitat that runs through this farm. There's a couple of lessons to take home from this. And the first, again, gets back to this fallowing of the land, just letting it rest for a year or for a season, or delaying the production on that through a critical time period. The yellowthroat, the common yellowthroat you see here, was a breeding bird that bred in this stand of grasses that were basically grass and vetch that were a cover crop that the farm planted. And they would typically want to mow this down to keep it from becoming too established and difficult to turn in for the crop they would plant in it in the spring. But they could easily delay that mowing for a month. And in that case, allowing the yellowthroats to complete their nesting cycle there and to harbor their fledglings in this quite thick vegetation during a time of year when it wasn't going to be important to use it for vegetative production. So there's lots of cool things that go on in these organic farms. Chief to them is not only being responsive to needs like the yellowthroat, but also just fallowing land using organic fertilizers like the Adam and his son are doing here. And this fallowing of land and planting of cover crops for the winter not only preserves soil nutrients and soil carbon sequestration and quality, but also provides wintering habitat for lots of waterfowl, in this case, in the Snohomish Valley, for swans and geese. The cool thing about Oxbow, this isn't your typical farm. They have a credible greenhouse that they use to grow native plants for plantings out in various parts of the community, and including in their own area where they're restoring some of the habitat along the Snoqualmie River, as I was mentioning. They've employed botanists. They have PhD restoration ecologists on staff that are experimenting with ways to deal with tough invasives like purple loosestrife, and also to how to germinate and reseed some of these native plants that the information just isn't known for. The interesting thing, the other lesson to get from a farm like this is that this is a farm that can exist and have things like this expensive greenhouse because of benevolent owners. The owners of this farm made their money elsewhere, and they put it back into this farm to hire the staff that they have to produce the sorts of structures that they need for this sort of research. And this is not an uncommon thing I found on some of these farms, that they are able to basically provide the land to the right sorts of farmers that then do the right thing with the land, but the farmer themselves probably couldn't afford the land or certainly the structures like this on their own from the proceeds from the farm. So this helps to have some sort of underwriting of land in this case, so that it's and guidance so that it's used in the correct way. But also there are multiple sources of income that come from an operation like this. They can sell plants in this case. They have corn mazes. They can rent cottages for people to stay at. I saw all these sorts of alternative ways of making ends meet employed on different farms and ranches that I visited as well. So it's rarely anymore that the small scale organic farmer just raises crops. Rather, they raise lots of other things for people to utilize. So I'm going to head quite far south now to Costa Rica. I've spent time there with students over the years, taking them to visit some of these various farms. And I want to start off with an area that is not on the tourist destination road for Costa Rica. It's the place called Mastatal. It's famous for some Americans that started a sustainability and permaculture facility there for people to come and learn how to raise things organically, to live very close to the land. But this is embedded in a Costa Rican farming community. Mastatal has just a little over 100 people that live there. They're all doing some sort of farming for their main income. And one of my favorites is Isidro, who's shown here on his horse, is how he gets to work each day, as he says, rides just down the hill to move his cattle in and out of pastures. He takes a very gentle touch to the land. He raises bulls and then sells them when they're a year or so old. The wildlife there responds to this grazing of the land. In this case, you see some yellow-headed caracaras that are insectivorous, perched on the heads of Isidro's cattle, and they're looking for various kinds of insects to pounce on for their dinner. Isidro's son and daughter-in-law, Marcos and Jenny, run at the same, another example of multi-use of these farms, basically a tourist destination for schools to come and stay, to learn about sustainable agriculture, to see the incredible biodiversity of Costa Rica. They're guides and photographers and teachers. And they're not alone there. Marcos and two of his friends from childhood, one of which here is Jorge, are also farmers in the area that are developing quite innovative ways to make a living off of their historic family farms, which were decimated by various sorts of diseases and other problems through the last several decades. But now they're coming back with adding ecotourism in Marcos's case. In Jorge's case here, he is developing a tourist facility for people to come and see how chocolate is made. They harvest chocolate, as he's showing here, reaching up to one of the pods, a cocoa pod, which will then he will make chocolate out of, that'll be used in beers, that'll be sold as powders and all sorts of confections that he is partnering with people from Belgium and all over the world to learn how to make these chocolates better and to serve them outside and within Costa Rica. They also practice sustainable agriculture on their land. They conserve water in one particular case here with deep mulching. So they mulch especially with cedar leaves, grind those up, that increases the soil moisture so that the plants can be productive for a longer part of the year. They also interplant within their orchards for chocolate, nitrogen fixing, plants with nitrogen fixing bacteria. They are native trees that not only enrich the soil, but provide habitat for birds and other animals. The last one of the three amigos here is Javier and his wife Rachel. And they also started as quite simply an agricultural producing farm, but have converted to having little higher end tourist cabins. They live right across, their farm is right across the gravel road from a new national park, La Cangreja. And they're able to, by being a buffer around that park, provide access for tourists to be able to come and stay and hike in the park, but also for wildlife to go in and out of the park in a fairly protected area. They also raise an endangered plant, a tree called the Plinia, which they then plant out into the national park and help reforest areas there. But this place, when you sit at Javier's farm, you can get an incredible bird list: toucans, tanagers, euphonias, and maybe if you're lucky, some of the raptors that come out from the park as well, like this forest falcon, colored forest falcon. And these birds basically have an expanded area that they can hunt, that they can forage within, because of these small scale farms that are in harmony with the larger natural reserves that are also there. And this is an important issue. What you often see conservationists arguing to just reserve land, and that's the only way that we'll be able to protect biodiversity. And it's absolutely true. There are some aspects of biodiversity that absolutely require big reserves with few people. But that's not tenable in a lot of places where people are living and trying to make a living as well. And this idea of sparing land, that is reserving it, can be contrasted with an idea of sharing the land. And that's what I saw farmers in Costa Rica regularly doing. sharing their land with wildlife like this forest falcon. And that allows not only tourism, agriculture, also conservation of biological diversity to happen at the same place. It allows the farmer to be in tune with this wildlife and benefit from it. His tourists that come there and stay and see a bird like this are excited, and they repay him monetarily with basically the biodiversity repays him monetarily by allowing people to come and view it. So there's a win-win again situation here where biodiversity and agriculture are benefiting one another. It can be taken to the extreme down there as well. This is Jack Ewing, and Jack came to Costa Rica in the 60s, 50s from Colorado State University as a cattle producer. His job was to go and raise cattle on a foreign-owned ranch in Costa Rica that decimated the forest so that they could produce hamburgers, basically for McDonald's and other fast food places up here. Over the years, as Jack worked in that line of business, which he loved, he saw the need to expand the amount of forest that was on his land, in particular, the connectivity among pieces of the land. So here's some aerial images of Jack's land, and it's called Hacienda Baru. The Baru River is here. It flows along the edge of the land. This is all along the Pacific. This is all area that was timbered at one point, but the trees have been removed for cattle pasturing. This is an image from the 70s. There's a highland area that is forested here still in this image. Jack was concerned about how monkeys and other animals could move through this part of the land. He saw them having trouble. He saw the opportunity to pretty easily increase their ability to travel. And he did this over the years so that Hacienda Baru, here's again the Baru River coming in on the side. This is all that area, this low area that was cattle pasture is now forested, just by not doing anything, just by first starting off with widening the fence rows that were there so there was more trees, and then letting nature reclaim that area. He did this, and the amount of biodiversity is spectacular there now. They have everything but jaguars back on this land. Even things as common and to me exciting as something like this riverside wren. So I want to head back to Montana and look a little bit more at ranching. We always think of ranching, often think of ranching, I should say, as a biologist as not being very compatible with wildlife conservation. They often remove the land cover there, or they degrade it heavily, or they are intolerant of predators, for example, that are on those lands. And I found that not to be the case at a ranch here in Montana. These are the Centennial Mountains. This ranch is a bit to the west of Yellowstone. And here in the area below here, the kind of river valley where a lot of the production of cattle occurs, it is also a national wildlife refuge. When I first went there, I saw lots of fences. I thought they were designed to keep the cattle out. In fact, they're designed to keep the cattle in to various pastures so they could graze it and then move to a different pasture in a rotational sequence so that each patch of land got some grazing, but not too much. And that was compatible with the leks of sage grouse that were there, with the thrashers, sage thrashers, and sparrows that lived there. And it made for quite a striking impression upon me that one could graze an area as sensitive as a national wildlife refuge and still also promote the biodiversity that was there. This is done by a family of ranchers, the Andersons. Andrew is shown here. They are not only using this rotational grazing that I described, moving from paddock to paddock, but they are using low stress handling. In this case, they are branding calves that are in a paddock with their mothers rather than separate from their mothers. They're using handling techniques to minimize the amount of time they're on the animal and the way the animal is held down and first taken away from its mom to get its inoculations and physical. By spending a lot of time with their animals, they know when one is sick. They can get if they can care for it, or they know when one dies quickly, they can get it out of there so there aren't carnivores like grizzly bears and wolves, which coexist in this landscape with them, attracted to those deaths, and therefore posing a problem for other members of their herd. And by having a close contact with their cattle, they can check in if they notice they're attentive to whether predators in the area, and they can haze them and use other techniques to keep them away. They've also bred their cattle to give birth later in the year when grass is available, rather than earlier in basically this time of year in Montana. They're starting to calve, so that their traditional way of raising cattle there, which is to basically have an early birth of the calves so they get as big as when they send them to those corn-fueled Midwestern feedlots to be finished. In contrast, what Andrew and his cowboys are doing here is raising their animals entirely on grass. And to do that, they have their births later in the year so that the young cattle are on the ground right at the time when the grass is healthiest and most productive for them and their mothers. Andrew's wife is Hillary, and she's a wildlife biologist who is with her sister-in-law, Andrew's sister, Malou Anderson, developing ways to get the community involved in non-lethal control of predators. As I said, they do things like keep close tabs when animals are down so they can get them out of the system before predators are attracted. They have used a variety of non-lethal deterrence, flaggery, but mainly cowboys that are out there with their herds often and frequently, and have a close eye on them and the potential predators in the area. And they work basically with the community to try to spread this message. It is not an easy topic at all to do. Most of the ranchers that live next to Hillary, or in another area where Malou and her family have another ranch that they work, they are basically against having predators on the land. But by starting with a shared goal of basically reducing their losses to predators, which all of the farmers or ranchers could agree with there, they were able to get some dialogue going and talking, and then demonstrating on various lands how some of these non-lethal techniques like flaggery around calf rearing areas can be effective. So they then try to move the goal from just reducing livestock losses to reducing livestock losses to predation while maintaining thriving wildlife populations. I'm sorry, it's late. And that's a harder lift for a lot of these ranchers to embrace, but they're starting to. They've had some converts. It's a work in progress, but they are making headway in getting people to think differently about how to live on the land with wolves and grizzly bears. A more traditional ranch occurs just a few miles away from the Andersons. This is John and Tom Malesnik, and they raise Angus. They also do this rotational grazing that Andrew does. So small paddocks, intensively grazed, move the cattle when the grass height is reduced about in half, move it to a new place to graze there while the other paddock recovers. But what I was interested in with Tom and John is not so much the cattle raising, because they do a very traditional cow-calf operation where they let the calves grow up and send them to the Midwest, but how they do this on an area that has spring creeks that are famous for fishing and fish trout production. And you don't typically think of grazing, especially intensive grazing, being compatible with water quality. But Tom has done a couple of things that I think are pretty innovative to allow grazing without damaging the stream. First off, as you see here, this graveled area is what he calls a hard crossing. And he's put in gravel on the banks and across the creek in a few places. And that's where his cattle go to drink. Rather than tearing up the bank all along the stream, they go to these few places that are solid and firm-footed for the animals, and they use those to get their water. And that keeps the water quality high because they're not silting up the stream. He's he's made this gravel bar, basically, and extended natural gravel bars to allow the cattle to have access to water without silting it up. The other thing he's done is he'll kind of flash graze the area right around the stream. He has some paddocks that are small, just a few acres, that encompass the stream side. And he'll put cattle in there and let them graze it for maybe 4 or 5, 6 hours, and then move them out of there. During this time, they take the palatable items of food, like some of the non-native grasses that occur there, and they eat those because those are their preferred forage. And what that does is allows the native sedges, which have a lot of silica, they aren't preferred forage items for the cattle. It allows those plants to survive and actually increase in their abundance along the stream and hold the stream bank firm. And so they basically, by grazing, he sets up a system where the grazers don't want to be close to the stream because that's where the worst forage occurs. And he's got not only nice trout streams, he also has bobolinks breeding on his land. Here's a male with a fledgling, and the bobolink is a species that suffered dramatically from agricultural practices. Again, if harvest occurs too quickly, if grass is cut too often throughout the season, you tend to get these birds while they're nesting, and their productivity and survivorship is reduced. But if you wait a while and allow some areas to not be harvested or to be grazed for short periods of time and recover quickly, then you can have bobolinks as well as cattle. So unfortunately, Tom had to sell his ranch, most of it, in 2014. This had been in his family since the early 1900s. And it's an unfortunately common theme across much of the Western US, where large family farms, many of which are managed in very ecologically beneficial ways like this one, cannot, in this case, the siblings of Tom wanted to get money basically by selling the farm rather than by continuing to ranch it. And when they did that, Tom he could not afford to buy them out at the prices that others that weren't going to ranch, but basically coming in from other businesses where they'd made a lot of money. They could afford these big ranches and they're buying them up. And some of them are being managed great. This one continues to be managed well. Fortunately, the new owner is interested in the wildlife value of this land, but that's not always the case. So just the economics, again, of trying to make a living off the land, doing what is right on the land is not always easy. So I want to sum up some of the main lessons that we get from sustainability research, as well as some of the things I learned on these farms. It's just a quick tour through a variety of places that I enjoy going, and I think you would enjoy as well. Well, scientists suggest 3 basic ways that we can do what seems to be impossible, and that is feed a population of humans is expected to top 11 billion in the next century, and that is increasingly affluent and wants an increasingly rich diet, heavy with meat. How are we going to do that and still maintain some biodiversity on this earth? Well, 3 things they suggest are: 1, getting the most we can out of every bit of agricultural land. So closing what they call the gap between what a land can produce and what it is currently producing. Also, wasting less. A third of food products are wasted now, either in the transportation chain or in your refrigerator. So coming up with ways to reduce that waste is an important way we can get more without having to sacrifice more land. And then reducing the amount of grain-fed ruminant meat that we have in our diet. It would be great if we were all vegans. That would make being a sustainable population a lot easier, but it's not going to happen. And we can do a lot just by reducing the amount of beef, goat, and sheep, for example, that we eat that is grain-fed, especially, not so much grass-fed. So first off, closing the yield gap. Just as this map areas in blue where there is basically mismatch between what could be produced and what is being produced there. So in Africa, for example, bean crops can become much more productive if they are selected. In this case, not artificially genetically modified, but just through selection, through regular selection practices, favoring beans that have extensive fine roots that can basically get more moisture from dry soil. So coming up with ways, even if they involve genetically modifying plants, to get the most out of low nitrogen or low water situations will be an important way to close those yield gaps. Wasting less. Compost is kind of the last ditch effort for vegetation plants that we would eat that have spoiled, and basically turning that matter back into the soil to increase soil fertility, carbon content in the soil, and productivity of it for the next crop is helpful. But there's lots of other things that can be done. It's been shown at buffets that just having smaller plates reduces the amount of food people take at a time, and therefore the amount they would waste by taking too much that they don't end up eating. And finally, adjusting our diet. There's some, I think, fairly simple ways that we can adopt a diet that is more compatible with reducing the effects of climate change, and also reducing the amount of land that will be needed to feed our growing and affluent population. So as an example, the text here shows a flexitarian diet that would provide people 2,000 or more calories a day and limit red meat in particular. So 1 serving of red meat per week, half a serving of white meat per day, and a single portion of dairy per day. That would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by half that we expect to be producing by 2050 from agricultural practices, which produces a lot of those gases. And doing basically combining that diet with reducing the subsidies to basically use corn for biofuel would allow us to feed about 1 billion more people on the existing cropland that we currently have. So understanding basically the ecological effects of the diet that you're choosing are important. It can help you make some sacrifices in a diet perhaps that are still healthy, even more healthy than a diet with more red meat in it, for example, and still even more healthy for the pastures that these animals are grown on. So beyond those things, what struck me most was how important it was to know your farmer, know the kinds of things they do with their land. Do they tolerate predators? You can see some of the things on their land by what's there, but you don't really know what they do with respect to wildlife. Do they favor it? Do they enjoy having it around? Do they showcase it like some of the farmers in Costa Rica to others and therefore gain additional revenue from that? How much water do they use? Are they maintaining habitats for pollinators and other wildlife in their area? Do they have a variety of crops? Do they fallow some land? All of these sorts of questions are ones that if you meet your farmer and talk with them, you can get answered. Or we're increasingly able to get some of this information through signage in some of the markets where crops like this are sold. And they might tell you something about the ethics of the farmer that basically produce the foods you want to consume. This is Frank Mueller. He's a farmer in California that grows peppers for sriracha and other sorts of things, lots of tomatoes, water intensive crops. But he has devices that control the amount of water each plant gets so that it gets just enough, but not too much, to reduce water waste and yet produce very healthy crops. And he works closely with Sarah Cross here, who is an agricultural ecologist who studies pollination and bird habitat, and has worked with Frank to understand how hedgerows might influence those species on his land. And basically, as I spoke with Frank and rode around his farm with him, he made it very clear that things he does there, the places he doesn't farm so that wildlife has a little space, the sorts of hedgerows he puts in for pollinators, are simply because it's the right thing to do. It just makes sense to him to have this sort of life around him on this farm. So I'd like to end just by emphasizing that we as consumers, we're consumers of agriculture. We have a lot of control over what is done on the land by exercising our right to purchase some crops and not others for our foods, to purchase some sorts of meat that are produced in some ways and others that are not, avoiding others that are not. But you need to know where the food's coming from. You need to know how it's raised to be able to make those educated choices, or to talk with the people that are purchasing these sorts of foods at markets to understand where they're coming from if we can't get there ourselves. Going to farmers markets and places like that allows you to have that direct interaction, which I think can't be beat. But at least being able to discuss with the sellers a little bit more about the situation where these vegetables or meat came from allows us to basically adjust not only our diet, but our shopping habits. And in that way, help shift the way our food is produced on the land so that not only we're able to feed more people, but we are also able to keep the land healthier and provide more for the wildlife that uses it. And as Aldo Leopold said, we basically, by making these choices, can increase the stability, integrity, and beauty of our land. And I would just ask you to look down this road. And on the left side is some of Frank Mueller's property, where weeds are allowed to grow next to the road. There's a hedgerow there where birds and pollinating insects can live and help pollinate his crops, and also just provide habitat for them. And on the right side is a different landowner that has a very industrial take on how to raise his crops. And I would certainly buy everything I could from this side of the road than from this side of the road, if that would make a difference in how this landscape looks and how it functions. Much better ecologically on Frank's property here than on his neighbors. So keep learning, read more about these sorts of things. You can visit my lab's website. There's a link there for it, but it's basically Avian Conservation Lab at the University of Washington. You can read more about the sort of work that these farmers are doing there. You can read the book that this is based upon, In Search of Meadowlarks, to learn a little bit more detail about some of the places I've visited. If you're interested in crows, as Sai said, I'm glad to talk with you about those. My wife and I worked with a couple of app designers and produced this app, Crow Scientist, for kids to be able to learn more about the crows around them, the kind of behaviors they do, the voices they have, and what some of their calls and behaviors mean. And I would encourage you, if you have kids who are interested in the world around them, to get into a app like this and use it to learn more about your natural world. With that, I would thank you for your attention. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person, but I appreciate you listening, and I'm glad to answer questions.